Ois Daled. So now the Rebbe is going to explain all this by first showing that the Rambam changes his language from the quote of the Mishnah in the last two halachas in Hilchos Milah, and that will be the key to the Rebbe's explanation. First, the Rebbe is going to try in Ois Hey to explain it what would appear to be simply at first glance. And the Rebbe is going to say in Ois Hey that that's not really a good interpretation. And then starting with Ois Vav, the Rebbe is going to give us the explanation of the Sicha. And we'll go step by step now. Dalet. Wird man das verstehen, behagdim habiur in the zwei letzte haloches in Rambam, Seif Hilchos Milah. So we'll understand this by first introducing the explanation in the very two last halachas in the Rambam in the end of Hilchos Milah. As the Rebbe said before, in the end of the laws of Milah, the Rambam talks about the greatness of Milah, and that is in two halachas in the end of Hilchos Milah. And the way the Rambam divides it up is as follows: and that's the language in the Erster from the Tzvei Halachas, in the first of these last two halachas, so quoting the first one. So first the Rambam says, Ma'uso hiya orlo shenizganu bo hagoyim, that the foreskin, if you don't have a circumcision, you have the foreskin, that's the orlo, is repugnant, because the goyim who don't circumcise have been degraded by it. They're called arelim. He quotes from the pasuk. They're called shenemar ki kol hagoyim arelim. All the goyim nations are arelim. That is a derogatory comment, and that's a derogatory statement about the goyim, that they don't circumcise and they have that foreskin. On the other hand, number two, the Rambam says, a Yid, his ultimate level of the Maila, it says, Gedoyla hi hamila, and Mila is great. Shaloi nikra Avram Avinu sholim atshemol. Avram Avinu was not called whole, Tomim. He was not called Tomim until after he circumcised. Shenemar, the pasuk says, Yisalich lefonai v'heye Tomim. Go, even though Avram was serving Hashem the whole time, the Eibishter says to him, go before me and be whole. When I give my covenant between me and you. So the covenant is the bris milah. That bris milah made wholesome to Avram Avinu. So that's a tremendous point. You see what circumcision does. The goyim who are not circumcised are repugnant. The Yid Avram gets his wholesomeness, his tmimus, through this circumcision. It says further, V'chol ha'meifir brisa shel Avram Avinu. Anybody who violates or removes the covenant of Avram Avinu, of the bris, and he doesn't circumcise, and he leaves his foreskin, or he pulls it to cover. He may have Torah, he may have good deeds. He has no part in the world to come. Meaning, see how important bris milah is. The goyim are degraded by it. It's called derogatory for them, megunim. Avram's shleimus comes after the bris. And our sages say, if you violate and you don't have circumcision, or you pull on your orla, then to cover, then you don't have a part in the world to come. That's it. Und then noch in der halacha shlachar. Then he has a new halacha, the final halacha that Rambam writes. Und then noch in der Bourei kamo chamurim mila. Look how serious circumcision is. It was not hung, it did not delayed even for one while, Moshe Rabbeinu was about to get killed. Ki Chasan Domim Li, he didn't circumcise his son. And the Malach came, and Tzipora quickly saved his life. Ki Chasan Domim Lamulis, Batikach Tzoyer, she took and she cut the Orlas Beno. So you see that it was such a serious, he was in the road, he's going to do it a little later. It was such a serious, it was not hang for Moshe Rabbeinu. Even for 1 hour, it was not going to Shem let it go, he would have cost him his life. He was on the road. No, that's how serious Bris Milah is. And the Rambam continues. And the other aspect, the Chol Mitzvahs HaTorah Nichresu Aleim Sholish Brisus Chulu. And the other thing is that all the mitzvahs of the Torah have been formed with only three covenants says in the Torah for all the mitzvahs. But Valamila, just this one mitzvah of Milah, the 612 mitzvahs, they have 3 covenants. But one mitzvah of Milah has 13 covenants. Kenal Reish Sif Aleph, as quoted before in the beginning of Sif Aleph. So this tells us how stringent Milah is. And then the Rambam adds with what we quoted before, the Hilchos Milah. So now, what is the source of the Rambam? The source of the Rambam is the Mishnah. And we find changes between the way the Rambam quotes and the Mishnah. And we have to understand what's the reason for these changes. And that explanation will answer the question that we had in the Sichos in the beginning. Why does the Rambam count this 13 and the Yerushalmi counts other 13? The Moker HaProtim for the Beida Halachas, the source of the details of these 2 halachas, is the Zelba Mishnah in Nedarim, is the same Mishnah in Nedarim that we were talking about before, that is, Torah was given with 13, with 3 old other mitzvahs, and this is only, and Bris Milah is with 13. The Rambam over is Mishana dem Seder and Oichdem Loshem Bekam Advorim. The Rambam, however, changes the order of the Mishnah, the way it's brought down, and also changes the language in many places. There is a difference here when we have to pay attention to see the differences. In their Mishnah is Nog the Maimer Me'usa Hi Ha'orla. So they both start with the same sentence, that it is repugnant to be uncircumcised, to be the foreskin is repugnant. And then in the Mishnah, Kumen di Maimorim Ba'ala Seder. So then come the following statement. The Rebbe is giving you now the order, the way the Mishnah quotes them. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, I think it's Rabbi Yehuda, I got to look it up, but I think it's Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Gedoyle Mila Shenichresu Aleha Shloish Esrei Brisus. That Milah is great. That's the first statement in the Mishnah. That Milah is great because there were 13 covenants formed on it. Actually, it's Rabbi Yishmael that says Gedoyle Milah Shenichresu Aleha Shloish Brisus. I said Rabbi Yehuda is Rabbi Yishmael. And then Rabbi Yossi says, Rabbi Yossi Omer in that Mishnah, that Gedoyle Milah Shadoiches HaShabbos HaChamura. Look how great circumcision is, that it can override, push away Shabbos, which is so strict, and yet Milah will take place on Shabbos. It will override the Shabbos that normally you're not allowed to make a wound on Shabbos, but a Bris Milah overrides it, and you can do it on Shabbos. That's another advantage. That's the advantage of Yosef. Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha Omer. He says, Rabbi Yeshua ben Korcha says, Gedoyle Milah sheloi nitlo leMoshe atzadik aleha. The greatness of Milah, that Moshe, the righteous one, has not been given even to hang for a while. Afilu molisha achas, even a 1 while. The Malach came right away. He was in the way. He was going to do it later. No, we wasn't going to wait. That's how important it is. Rabbi Nechemia says, that Mila is great, that it can override the Negoim. If a person has a nega, even though one is not permitted, there's a violation, a law against cutting a nega. But Mila Betzaras, if you are removing the foreskin and you are removing the tzaras with it, it overrides the mitzvah of Mila. And Rabbi says, Gedoyle Mila, Shekol HaMitzvahs She'os Avram Avinu, the greatness of Mila is that all the mitzvahs that Avram Avinu did, Lo Nikra Shalom, he wasn't called whole, Ad Shemol, until he circumcised. Shenemar, Hisalach Lefonai Ve'yitomi, go before me and you will be complete. So we see the Mila is what makes him complete. Okay, this is the Mishnah. Now let's compare the Rambam to the Mishnah that we just said. So first off, let's see the two things that the Rambam doesn't even mention at all. The Mila, that it overrides Shabbos, and Negoim, that you can do Mila even though you'll be violating the Shabbos, but it pushes away. You're not violating because it pushes it away. And that Mila pushes away the Negoim, which you're not allowed to cut off. The Rambam doesn't bring it down. So we can say, the Rebbe said, that's simple, because the Rambam has already mentioned that before in the halachas, when he was talking about, he says already these halachas. The Rambam bringt on nicht die zwei morim as gedele Mila. These two statements, that Mila is great, was is doiches ha-Shabbos and doicha negoim, that it can push away the Shabbos and push away negoim. That you can answer, kemen zogen, as is sich seimech, that he is relying of them was Hashem free and Hilchos Mila gebracht la halacha, that he already previously in the laws of Mila brought la halacha, Mila bismano, doiches ha-Shabbos, when Mila is on the time, which means on the 8th day, then it overrides the Shabbos. Of course, if it's not on the 8th day, if you have to push it off, then you can't do it on Shabbos. But Mila bismano is doiches Shabbos, ubein bismano, ubein shloi bismano. And then any time, whether it's on the 8th day or not on the 8th day, doiches ha-tzaras, it pushes away the tzaras, you can do the Mila, even though you'll be cutting away the tzaras. So that much we understand why the Rambam doesn't say it. But now let's look in the order. The Rambam brings down all the other things that the Mishnah brought down, the other stuff, the other points. But then the order is totally mixed up. Why does he change the order as it pertains to the other statement? Zum Ersten, in the beginning. So he does start up with what the Mishnah, Nedarim, the Rambam, and the Mishnah are straightened out. They start off, gleich noch me'usei orla. But after this first statement that orla is repugnant, which the Mishnah says, the Rambam bringt dem letzten Maimer, he brings the last statement in the Mishnah, that Gedoyle hi Mila shlo nikra Avram Avinu shalom chulu, that Mila is great, that Avram wasn't called whole until he does the bris. That's brought down in the Mishnah last. The Rambam brings it the second thing, as soon as after the first thing that Moshe Orlo. La'achar is that. After that, bringt betur maimer bifnei atzmei from Masechta Ovis. Then he brings its own statement. That's not Bechlal mentioned in the Mishnah. That's a statement in Masechta Ovis. Anybody who would undo the covenant of Avram, not do circumcision, has no part in the world to come. That's from Pirkei Avos. That's from Masechta Avos. So that's not brought in the Mishnah. The Rambam brings it in here. So that takes care of the second before the last halacha. In the Mishnah, then he goes back and says in its own halacha, the statement in our Mishnah, that it didn't hang for Moshe Rabbeinu. We didn't allow this. Eibishter didn't even allow this even for 1 hour. He brings that down next. Und zum Soif, and then at the very end, he brings them ersten Maimer in the Mishnah. He brings then at the end of the Rambam, he brings the very first saying in the Mishnah, Mailas Hamilo as Nichresu Allah Yud Gimel Brisus. That's actually the very first, even before Meusa Orlo, which Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, the Mishnah says over there, um, 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 which after Musa, the very first meaning after the Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Shmuel says the case of Gedei Lamila Shenichresu Allah. So after, at the end, he brings down. This is really the second, but that's the first after Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. I think what the Rebbe is calling it the Me'ershter because the first one is Musa Orlo. But Musa Orlo and is brought down both by the Rambam and the Mishnah. So, and then the first statement after the what we do mention is the Mishnah Maila Samila Nichrusala Yudgimel Brisis. So what's that? It was formed 13 brises. So what's the order over here? Seems to be arbitrary. So basically, why does the Rambam quote the Mishnah in a different order than the Mishnah? As the Rebbe explains, he doesn't mention the two cases of Milah, his overrides Shabbos and Negoy, because he had already said that. But then the other things, the order is out of order. And then he brings in the Mefer Brisa Shel Avram Avinu. The Rebbe wants to suggest that maybe one can argue that there is two parts. The Rambam, one part is as it pertains to the person, the gavra, that a person has to have a circumcision, not so much the mitzvah, but to tell us about a person without a bris. The goyis without a bris, a yid without a bris is terrible. And kol hamefer, this is all talking about the gavra, about the person. And this last halacha is talking about the mitzvah of the milah, not so much what the gavra, but the requirement and the mitzvah of the milah. Maybe that's why, and that would fit with the order of the Rambam. As the Rebbe explains, hey, the Pashtus Yeshloimar, simply one can say, as the Rambam stellt oizem seder ha-maimorim, that the Rambam sets up the order of these statements, behesem mit dem, with the Rambam nemt on dem chiluk b'toichnam, that fits together with that which the Rambam, the contents of these maimorim, so the Rambam organizes them according to their idea, according to their content. That's how he places them, behind, and that is. As in dem zayne dort zwei suge meilos, there is two categories of greatness within the Bris Milah. Was es zerteilt sei in zwei besondere halachas, the Rambam divides them into two separate halachas. In the erster halacha ches, in the first halacha, in halacha ches, read the Rambam the inyonim in Bris Milah v'chazayne b'shaychus la'gavra. The Rambam discusses the circumcision and the covenant of the circumcision that relate as they're connected to the person. Und der Sug is koilo dishlila, and that category also includes the negative. Those was that it's repugnant to have the foreskin. That was degrading. That's the shame of the goyim. That's included in that. And under chiyuv, gedoyle yamila shel nikar Avram Avinu sholim, that Avram is called only whole because of the greatness of Milad Shemol until he had to circumcise. So you see that the person, the degradation of the goyim and the advantage of the person until he circumcised. On the river, and that's why to follow this, he brings in the statement of the Pirkei Avos, Oich the minor from Masechta Avos, also the saying from Tractate Avos, Kol hamefer brisach hu le'eino chelik le'olam haba. Anyone who removes this and abolishes the bris by not circumcising, or Moshe Chalose, Ein Lechelek L'Olam Haba, has no part in L'Olam Haba. Was is Benegei zu Gavra? That's the person. In der zweiten Halacha, in the final Halacha, in Halacha Tes, redt der Rambam wegen die Inyonim Benegei zu der Meise und Chefze shel Mitzvos Milah. Over there, the Rambam discusses the ideas, the acts, and the object of the Mitzvos Milah. The mitzvah, the action of circumcising, and what Milah is, the value of it. Und der Far bringt die andere Mamora Chazal. That's why he brings here the other sayings of our sage of blessed memory. That Moshe Rabbeinu was not even allowed 1 hour. The Hashem didn't wait for him. He needed to do it. He was going to be guilty. An inyan in shlila. Also, this is a negative. How important it is. It also fits with the negative as far as the person is going. It starts with that. On kol ha-Torah mitzvahs, kol mitzvah Torah nichnasu aleim grimul brisus, and then to say the positive, that all the Torah mitzvahs have only 3 bris. Alamila nichlasu yud gimel brisus im Avram Avinu, and with the circumcision there's 13 bris with Avram Avinu, and inyan chiyuv, something in the positive. So that is the reason, the way the Rambam organizes it. So that much the Rebbe explains, we understand. But the Rebbe says one of the things is, there's another thing telling over here, is that Rambam doesn't just change the order, which could be explained like that, but the Rambam also changes the wording. In the Mishnah it says Gedoyla Mila, and the Rambam writes Chamura. Es ist aber nicht verstandig, was the Rambam is Mishana. There's a change. The following is known as Aleph. In der Mishnah is the Loshen Gedoyla Mila. By Bedinyon, by both aspects, the language is great. Gedoyla Mila shenichlesu Aleha Yud Gimel Brisos, that it's Mila is great, that it was formed 13 covenants. So we use the word the greatness of Mila, and also Gedoyla Mila shlenitna loy Moshe, and also the greatness of Mila, all Gedula, that Eibishter didn't wait for him, even for 1 hour, for not circumcision. Uses the word Gedoyla. The Rambam in the Erster Halacha sagt, the first Halacha, he says, Gedoyla hi Mila. Like, it's great, that he's not called whole until he's circumcised. But in the zweite Halacha, but in the second Halacha, is a Mishana Meloshna Mishnah Gedoyla. Over there, he changes from the Lashon Mishnah that says great. How serious it is, Mila. So in the second, second halacha, when he brings down from Moshe, he says Chamura, not Gedoyla. And the Rebbe says that this Chamura is not only for the negative, that it wasn't weighted, but also for the positive, that we say Yud Gimel Mida, Yud Gimel Brisis are also Chamura. The Chamura goes on both the Rebbe things, the negative, that Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't waiting and that Zokter Bevav HaMoisif, he says V'chol Mitzvahs HaTorah. So that means, so that is serious. Also not the word Gedoyla, but so the word Gedoyla is also applies, the Rebbe learns, because the Rambam says V'chol Mitzvah Torah. Was from Pashtus L'Shon is mashma, from the simple language it appears, as der Wort Chamura batzit sich euch zum zweiten Inyan, that it also refers to this second, to the mitzvahs, to the positive, that there are certain brises by Mila makes it Chamura. Vos of Mila nichresu shloishes brises, that makes it Chamura. So in the Mishnah, it says both Gedola and both, it says. And the Rambam writes Gedola in the first halacha, in halacha ches and halacha tes, he says Chamura. And the Rebbe is saying he actually changes it on the Nichrusu Shloisha Cerebrisis, because in the Mishnah, Gedoyle Mila Nichrusu Allah Yud Gimel Brisis. And the Rambam writes Chamura also on the Shloisha Cerebrisis. The Vit tells us that's also Chamura. Not only Shaloi Nitlo Lamoshe, but also on Nichrusu Shloisha Cerebrisis. Why does the Rambam say Chamura, not Gedoyle? So that's number one that we need to understand. Euch for the Tzgebir, but also we need to explain. Base, this is the second thing we need to understand. In the Mishnah state blois gedoyla milo shenichruso leho yud gimel brisos, that milo is great, that it has 13 times bris. Nit der monig dem Yisrael from milo legabe kol mitzvah Torah. We're not saying that it's greater than all the mitzvah Torah, which only have 3. We're just talking about the greatness that this has 13. This idea that Mila is greater because it has 13 verses, all the mitzvahs we only have 3, was that in Vert gebracht in Gemara b'makom achar. That's brought in the Gemara in another place. B'mesechta brachas. Over there it says tzorich sheyagdim bris l'Torah. That one needs to have the benching when we say. So we say al bris samto b'vsarenu, v'al teiros choshilemadetonu, that bris comes before Torah because bris has 13 and Torah has only shazunitna b'sholosh bris v'zunitna b'yud gimel brises. And therefore, bris comes before Torah because bris was given with 3 and this was given with 13. But that's a separate place in the Gemara Brachas, but it's not here. Here we're just saying the Maila of Mila that it has 13 bris. Why does the Rambam bring that in? Gimel. The Rambam bringt da nicht mit dem Loschen, al derech Loschen ha-Gemara. So number 3, the Rambam bringt us nicht mit dem Loschen, al derech Loschen ha-Gemara. He doesn't bring this with the language, but it says in the Gemara, Kol ha-Toira kulo nichresu aleho or nitna begimel brises. Over there, all of Torah, of course, Torah has mitzvahs in it. So the Gemara, when it talks about brisle Torah, it doesn't say brisle mitzvahs in the Gemara Brachas. No, it says he should have said, it would seem, it would feel kol Torah kulo nichus or nitnu begimel brises kilushoyne free in Hilchos Brachas, as he says before. The Rambam in Hilchos Brachas when I bring the Maimer and Al Brachas. When the Rambam quotes this saying, he says over there Torah. The result kol mitzvahs haTorah nichrusu aleim, but he says specifically the mitzvahs haTorah. So the Rebbe has 3 issues. While the Rebbe answered part of it that it's different, how the halachas are split, the Rebbe remains here with 3 questions. Why does it say change in halacha tes to the loshen chamura versus the loshen gedola? Why do we have to mention in the Rambam versus anything? In the Mishnah, it's not mentioned. It says it's Mila is 13 times bris. Doesn't have to say versus. That is the whole Torah. And why does the Rambam specifically say mitzvahs? This all leads to the explanation that the Rebbe is going to explain now. The Rebbe explains that basically there's 2 uh, parts of the bris milah, the fact that it makes a covenant, and the fact that it's a mitzvah protis, but it's a special mitzvah, but it's two aspects to it, and sometimes these are two very distinct ideas that the Rambam is discussing over here. And the Rebbe brings some examples from other cases where we have the mitzvah in general, and then we have the specific. The general theme is a bris, and the mitzvah is to make the circumcision. As we find that the general mitzvah of teshuvah, or the general mitzvah of tefillah, is the general. Then we have the confession, then we have saying the words when you're davening. Here, we have the covenant, and we have the specific, the milah. Let's look inside. Say the explanation. In bris milah in the circumcision covenant, there are two aspects. Aleph, the inyan kloli from bris. The general theme, the idea, a covenant, to make a covenant with the Eibishter. And base, a covenant is a general idea. And base, bris als mitzvah protis, and the circumcision, this is a very specific individual mitzvah to circumcise. Become a mitzvah similar to what we find in many mitzvahs. Ledugma, by mitzvahs tefillah. Say, for example, with the mitzvah of davening, that inyan ha'avodah from tefillah, the general idea of serving Hashem, is through prayer. Was me lernt up from the avdei b'chol levavchem. We learn it out to serve Hashem. Davening is the service of Hashem, and yet, that is general, serve God. But this is, in the general idea, davening is part of our service to Hashem. Now, we have there is, however, a very detailed, specific, which is prayer. That is to command, not just to serve Hashem as a general theme, but to verbalize, to daven, to say the words. And that is the reason, was the far, that's why, explains why the Rambam would count prayer as a mitzvah. Generally, mitzvahs kolu, serve Hashem is not a countable mitzvah. The Rambam doesn't count them. The Rambam counts tefillah because it has that specific prayer that you have to verbalize and daven to Hashem. Was the far lechen the Rambam in minyan atarayag mitzvahs mitzvahs tefillah. That's why the Rambam counts as part of the 613 mitzvahs also the mitzvah tefillah. Choch as schreibt in the Sharoshim, although he writes in the roots, as ein roi limnis hatzivuyim hakelolim hatoira kulam, that it's not proper to count the general mitzvahs that we are told to listen to Hashem, to serve Hashem. Those are mitzvahs that include all of the Torah. That's not a mitzvah. We don't count. So to serve Hashem should not be a mitzvah because this includes all of the Torah. Vitfila. So why do we count it? The Rambam zogt. The Rambam explains why do we count davening. There is a unique, specific designation, which is a command to daven. There's a command to serve, but there's a special command to daven. Davening is a specific way of serving Hashem. Similar is also with the idea of tshuva. There's the general theme of tshuva, to have remorse, regret the past, and the acceptance of the future. This is a general command on his verbunden. It's tied to just accepting the yoke of the heaven for all mitzvahs, everything, just to do the right things and stay away from the bad things. Was ist Betzivun Kololum is verbunden mit Kabbalah Sil Machal Shemaim. It's connected to accepting the yoke of the heavenly kingdom. Was the far wird is nicht gerechnet in Minyan mitzvahs. That's why we don't count it in the number of the mitzvahs. The general inyan of accepting the yoke and the tshuva as a general theme, because this is for all of Torah, that is basically to follow the Torah. That's a general tzivui, it's a tzivui koilel. But yet, but there is still a specific idea of tshuva, was besteht from vidu dvorim, that is to confess of the words, that the Rambam does count. Das wird gerechnet in Rambam, in Minyan mitzvahs, that's counted at the number of mitzvahs to confess. Uns ist verstandig, but it's understood. As beim Mekayim sein dem Inyan meyuchat from Tefillah, that when you're fulfilling that special part of davening, bedibur, speech, other tshuva, bevidu dvorim, or when you do tshuva, that you're confessing and you're saying the words of confession. Hat man nicht nur dem Geder Proti Shabozeh, not only do you have the specific, the detailed definition over here, nor echt the minyan kloli from Tefillah and Tshuva, but you also includes in it the general idea of prayer and Tshuva, Hakol La Torah Kula, which includes all Torah. So when you're doing a part of it, it really includes inside everything else. On Al Derech Zeh Unoch Mer is the Benegeli Bris Milah. Similar to this, and even more, is that it pertains to circumcision. This is a mitzvah protis. Yes, it's an individual mitzvah. Eine von the Taryag mitzvahs, one of the 630 mitzvahs. Bris Milah is aber euch inyan kloli. However, Bris Milah is also a general. It's a general idea too. Bris von Eden b'chole b'irem b'chulu. This is a covenant for Eden, all of their limbs and in your name and all of their matters. Bit to be connected to Hashem. It's a covenant with Hashem. B'siglin achat, to use another style. Says the bris ugmar kedushas Yisrael b'yed midin. That's the covenant, and that's the completion of the sanctity of a yid by every yid. So this brings about, it's a personal mitzvah. It's a specific mitzvah, but it brings around that level of holiness, that level of connection, that level of covenant between the yid with the Eibishter. And the Rebbe says this is actually found very emphasized when we talk about a convert. As we find these two aspects, the general covenant and the bris as a finalizing connection, by it's emphasized when we talk about the circumcision of the ger, that inyan kloli from mila als gather from gerus, the general idea of circumcision, that this is the defines what conversion. Der mit geiter arain in kedushas Yisrael. For the ger to become a yid, he goes through it's not just doing a mitzvah, but by him, he's doing, that makes him a yid. And then you have a milah scheme, mitzvah protish milah. Then you have separately fulfilling the mitzvah as is one of the mitzvahs that you have to do. The Ragachover is das mevayer, as explained the Ragachover. So basically, the Rebbe says there's two aspects of the bris. There is the specific mitzvah, but then there is the general theme that the bris milah brings you into the covenant that completes the sanctity of a yid. And this will explain now the two halachas that the Rebbe continues in Ois Zayin. Ois Zayin, the Rebbe continues now how these are the two halachas in the Rambam. Und da seien die zwei halachas in Rambam, these are the two halachas, halacha ches and tes, in the end of Hilchos Milah. In der ersten halacha, halacha ches, read the Rambam wegen dem Inyan Kloli. Over there, the Rambam discusses the general idea that Klolos die Konteuchen von Bris Milah, the general content of circumcision and the covenant. Wie das ist verbunden mit dem Geder Kedushas Yisrael, that how it is tied with the sanctity, with the definition of the Jewish sanctity, that part of the Jewish sanctity is the Bris Milah. Und in der zweiten Halacha, Halacha Tes, in the second Halacha, in Halacha Tes, is der Medubar wegen der Mitzvah Protis. Over there, the discussion is the individual, the mitzvah, the specific mitzvah. The Geder Proti from Bris Milah, the detailed and specific definition of Bris Milah. The Far Zog der Rambam in der erster Halacha. That's why in the first halacha the Rambam says Meusa hi ha'orlo shenizganu bo hagoyim, that the orlo, the cover, is repugnant because that is why the goyim have been degraded by that. Shenemar kekol hagoyim arelim, all the goyim are arelim, are stuffed, don't have a bris. Was der mit meint nicht bloß zu madgir sein. The miyus uvenus shebe'orlo is not mainly emphasizing how disgusting and the degradation that is in having an orlo, having the foreskin. Nor beikir mainly wants to, as in dem besteht der Hevdel zwischen Goyim und Bnei Yisrael. That is what is the consistent difference between non-Jews and the Jewish people. As orlo is azach shenizganu bo hagoyim. Orlo is something in which the goyim have been degraded by. Und in der Öftu von Mila, and what Mila accomplishes that those shaft the shleimus in Yisrael, that creates that wholesomeness by Yidden. Und der Kesher habris von Yidden mit Neighborsten, and the formation and the knot of the covenant between a Yid with Hashem. That's the difference between a Goy and a Yid. Goys are Arelim and Yidden are connected through the bris. Und das ist Musber in dem, was the Rambam sagt noch dem. This is explained with what the Rambam says following this. Gedoyle hi hamila shalei nikra Avram Avinu sholem ad shemol. That the reason Mila is great because Avram Avinu was not considered whole until he circumcised Shemol, till he circumcised. Shnamar, Yisalach lefonev heyetomim ve'etna bris b'ni v'necha goymer. Go before me, and then you'll be complete when I give my covenant between you and me through the bris. The shleimus from Yisrael, the bris mit Neibersten, the wholesomeness. How does a yid become complete? The covenant, which is the covenant with Hashem, is durch Milah Davke, specifically through Milah. Und der Riber is the Rambam Mamshich and the Halacha. That's why the Rambam continues in this Halacha and brings the Maimer Mesechta Ovis and brings the statement, the saying of Tracta Ovis, Kol HaMeifir Brisa Shel Avram Avinu Chulu. Anybody who undoes or who violates, who absolves and doesn't do the covenant of Avram Avinu, doesn't circumcise, even though he learned it and he has good deeds, he has no portion of the world to come. But does that man here you see in a very protruding, in a very obvious way, Aviful Bris Milah is verbunden mit der Etzem Geder Kedush Yisrael. How much the circumcision covenant of the circumcision is tied with the essence, the definition, the sanctity of a yid, because without it is no Elam Haba. So you see that it's not Maisim Tovim and it's not a Torah, it's the bris. You see how much the bris is the connecting piece between the Eibishter and a yid. That's the first halacha. And that's why he brings down to demonstrate this from the Sechta Ovis, to demonstrate how strong the connection of a bris is, the connection. In the zweite halacha, the Rambam, wegen mitzvah als a mitzvah prot. Second halacha, the Rambam discusses circumcision as his individual mitzvah. As afile va mitzvah protis, even as an individual mitzvah, hat in sich a meilen isefes legabe alle andere mitzvahs. It still has As a mitzvah, it has an additional advantages relative to other mitzvahs. And das ist der Rambam madgish b'shinui l'shoyne glach b'tchilos ha'alocha. The Rambam emphasizes this by changing the language from the Mishnah in the beginning of the halacha. Bo yurei kama chamura mila. How serious mila is. Nit gedola, not great mila. Wer sagt in der Halacha Kedemes, as he said in the previous Halacha, wie Loshen HaMishnah Kenal, and as the Mishnah says. But the Rambam, here the Rambam is discussing wegen der Chumra, about the stringency, the penalty, and similar. We're talking about the seriousness of this mitzvah. Besuloi, nothing more. We're not talking about that it makes complete, that it makes a yid, it's a connection with the Ebrish, that we're talking about the performance of the mitzvah, how serious it is. For Milah, the Chumrah for Milah, how serious the circumcision, that mitzvah is. Milah als mitzvah protis. Milah as a individual mitzvah. Und der Reif passt the Loshen Chamura. And for that, the language is serious, because we're talking as a mitzvah protis. Not talking about the Maila Gdoila of Mila. It's talking about the mitzvah. And in them bringt the zwei inyonim. And here the Rambam brings the two aspects. That it didn't hang for Moshe. We didn't allow this for Moshe, even though for 1 hour, even though it was in the road, and yet he was going to be punished for it. Was weist of the Grace Harbkeit for Mitzvahs Milah, which shows the great seriousness of the Mitzvah Milah. Und noch ein Inyan in welchem es zet, wie viel sis chamore Milah, legabe andere mitzvahs. And there's another aspect in which we see how serious circumcision is when we measure it next to other mitzvahs. Chol mitzvahs ha-Torah, specifically mitzvahs. We're talking about the mitzvah of Milah here. We're not talking about the mitzvahs of Milah, Chol mitzvah Torah. Nichresu aleihen sholish brises. They will only have 3 brises for all mitzvahs. Well, a Milah nichresu shloish esre brises. But for Milah there is 13 brises. V'hainu adoret der nid wegen der Meile von Milah legabe klolus ha-Torah. We're not talking about the advantage of Milah relative to generally Torah. When you measure it relative to each individual mitzvah, from all mitzvah Torah, every mitzvah of the Torah has only 3. The mitzvah of Milah, one mitzvah of Milah, and any other mitzvah has 13 by Milah. Each mitzvah is been formed 3 bris, and ala Milah nichresu yud brises. By Milah, it was formed 13 brises. That's the Rambam. In Mishnah, the Rambam is talking about the mitzvah of Milah. In the Mishnah, we're talking about the idea of circumcision. The Mishnah, with the Loshen is Gedoyla Milah, Shenichrusu Allah Yud Gimel brises. The Milah is great, that the 13 brises were formed in it. Gedoyla, in this word, this context, Gedoyla, means greatness, al derech godel shekoilel bekol mokim, the godel which it includes, as in every place, lifi inyone, based on what the topic we're talking about. Godel means either adult b'shonim years, either a godel b'chochma, he's adult in wisdom, or he's b'yira shamayim, in fear of heaven, or godel ba'anokim, a great amongst giant. Bizal derech godel Havaya, even to say Havaya is great. Where der mit der meint, in the Gemara, the discussion is, the meaning is the Godel, der Inyan Kloli for Milah, the general idea of Milah. The Milah is an Inyan Kloli in ganz Torah mitzvahs. Over there, how Milah is a general idea in all of Torah mitzvahs, not measuring a mitzvah for mitzvah, but measuring the idea of Milah, the status of Milah within the whole Torah. Was the Farizi Gedoyla fun kol ha-Torah mitzvah. That's why it's greater than all of, not individual, but all of Torah mitzvahs. Der mit was nichresu Allah yud gimel brises, because the fact that there's 13 covenants, that makes it greater of all the Torah, Mashenkin Kol HaTorah Chulu, as opposed to all the Torah Vosef Dem Zaning Vem Lois Gimel Brisses, which there was only three covenants. So this explains now the 13, the number, the way that Rambam counts it and the way the Yerushalmi counts it. Yes, Apizevet, men verstehen dem Chiluk zwischen dem Rambam und dem Yerushalmi will understand the difference between the Rambam and the Yerushalmi. Was the Rambam bringt nicht den friedigen Posik. He doesn't bring the previous Posik by Yemahu Koros Havayas Avram Brislemer that Hashem formed the covenant with Avram. Say, Chocher werd gebracht in Yerushalmi, although it brought in Yerushalmi. In Yerushalmi, he brings it down, Kum der Maimer v'apirush biur of Divra Mishnah. In the Yerushalmi, it comes as an interpretation, explanation of the words of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, G'doyla mila shenichrusola shloishas brisais. That mila is great, talking about the greatness, that it had 13 covenants. The hainu the mailon gedula from mila als bris koli. That is this talking about the advantage and the greatness of mila. So general, it's a covenant. Was is verbunden mit dem Geder Kedushas Yisrael B'chlal, which is associated, tied to the general definition of the sanctity of Yidden, the covenant. Und zu dem Inyan is euch shaykh der Posik. So for the general covenant of Yidden, it also applicable, it fits the Posik by Yemahu Korsav Avram Bris Leimer. That Hashem made a formal covenant. It's talking about Bris Ben Absorim. It's talking about Yerush Oris. But in the general theme of covenant, that makes sense. That has a connection. The Asbor in there. Even though that the general formation of the covenant with Hashem, kum bepoil durch dem bris proti, it comes actually through this specific covenant that takes place with this circumcision, durchenkim from the mitzvah protish mila, by fulfilling the individual specific mitzvah of mila, brisi b'psarchem librisoilom, my covenant in your flesh for an eternal covenant. Similar to tefillah and tshuva, that you have to actually daven, you have to actually do vidui. Afal is the bris kloli faram b'yeder eden. But still, the general connection, the general covenant is by every yid. Let's say there was a reason, according to her, he didn't have to. He can't, or he wasn't able to mekayim zay mitzvahs milah b'poil. He is still not lacking generally. He's still part of the bris, even though he can't perform this individual bris because of medical other situations. The Mishnah sagt in Nedorim, the Mishnah says in Nedorim, if a person makes a vow, koine, she'eni nene la'arelim, I am not going to have any benefit from those who are uncircumcised. Still, mutar barali Yisrael, if a yid hasn't circumcised, he is allowed to have a benefit from him. He's not included in that vow, but the circumcised of the goyim, he is not allowed. If he says, why? Because a yid that is not circumcised is not considered an orel, and an orel that is a goy who is circumcised is still considered an orel. But if he says, she'eni nena lemulim, I'm not going to have benefit for those who are circumcised, asur barale Yisrael, he would still be prohibited by uncircumcised, even though he only prohibited himself those circumcised. And he would be permitted in those who are circumcised. Because when he says, I'm not going to benefit mulim, it means yidden. Mulim is another word for yidden. So even if the guy is circumcised, he can still benefit from him because he's not called a circumcised. Why? Orlo, that's the name of a goy. The goyim are called arelim. Shenemar kikol arelim, agoyim arelim. They're all arelim. Chol Beis Yisrael arli leiv are stuffed to the heart, but they're arelim. Mitam bazeh, mutam bazeh. So this gives you good sense, good taste for was the Mishnah bring them Maimer als Hagdoma to the Vaitedike Mamorim. Why the Mishnah brings this statement as an introduction to all the further statements. Usahi ha'orlochulu, that the uh, that it brings down the halacha, the saying that is mutter, and because when it says Mu'usi Orlo Gedoyle Amilish Nichs Chulu, the Ram is to hint to us as the bris kloli is be'etzem faram by Yednin, to tell us that there is general covenant exists by every Yid. Nor the Gemar had over bepoilu begilui. It's only the completion of it in actuality, openly, tuft sich oif durch dem kiyum from bris mila b'sarchem, by performing the mila in your flesh. So basically, we're all mulling, whether we mull or not, but literally, we have to go through the bris. To say the reason, so it was by the first Yid, Avram Avinu. The bris koli zwischen dem Avram Avinu, the general theme, the general covenant between Hashem and Avraham Avinu is not given bisman and durch bris milah. That wasn't at the same time, and it didn't take place through the circumcision. But asach yorim fardem, much before it, bris ben avsorim, during the covenant between the pieces. Koras havayis Avram bris lemer goymer, Hashem formed the covenant with Avram, saying, etc. Und das is given a bris mit Avram v'zarei achrav. That was a covenant with Avram and his seed afterwards. Whether they make a bris or not, that was it. Nor then noch. But later, many years later, he's given their tzivu from Eibers, and there was the command of Hashem to Avram, as other bris that covenant that already took place needs to be set in the flesh durch mitzvah mila, through the mitzvah of circumcision. Therefore, is es euch by Zari Achrav. That's why it's also by his children later on. The bris kloli zwischen Aiden und dem Ebersten is alamo kayim. The general covenant between a Yid and Hashem is always in existence. Gleich kishenoilot, as soon as he's born. Even if it's a case when the brothers died because of circumcision under Farley Mol, and therefore he could not circumcise, he is still part of the covenant. Gleich wird geboren is b'kedushas Yisrael. As soon as he's born, he has the sanctity of the Jewish people. Is verstandig. So based on this is understood. As the Yud Gimel Brisis was the Rambam Rechentois, that the 13 covenants that the Rambam enumerates, seinem Betoichnom dieselbe wie die Yud Gimel Brisis, are in contents the same 13 covenants, welche werden gerechnet in Yerushalmi, the same as in Yerushalmi. Nor der Yerushalmi is Magdim. It's the same 13. The Yerushalmi just introduces Hagdoma Le'inyan. Le'nichnas ba'aminyan shebe'inyan. He's just giving you the introduction, and he's not here telling you the number over here. He's just giving you the context over here, the concept. The pasuk bayem hu koros Avram as Hashem Avram bris lemer goymer, not to say this is one of the 13. Valeret frir vegem mila als bris kloli, since he is discussing the mila as a general covenant. Das heißt, wie das was nicht soll yid gimel brisis. The fact that there is 13 covenant is madgish as mila is a bris kloli zwischen an Eid mit Neibsten. That is a general covenant between a Yid and Hashem. The Rebbe bringt it als Hagdoma Lozed and Posik, and that's why, as an introduction, he brings the verse was read wegen the bris kloli, not as to count it as one of the 13, but to say the verse that talks about the general covenant. The Rambam kommt aber in der zweiten Halacha sagen, but the Rambam in the second Halacha is coming to say, as euch Mila als Mitzvah Protis is Chamura from Kol Mitzvah Torah, that even Mila as an individual mitzvah is more serious than all Mitzvah Torah. The Ribber Hodonit Kenordam Posuk, there's no room for the verse by Yemu Koros Shas Avram Sabris Lamer. It's not talking about the bris of Mila, it's talking about another bris. Was read wegen the bris Kloli. Hagam as euch dos is faran in Mila. This too, bris Kloli is in Mila, but we're not talking about that part, the bris Kloli that takes place through the Mila. We're talking about the Mila itself, the bris. Now, the fine from Posuk wird no brisi. Bis zum Posuk was bris Yokemes Yitzchok. The Yud Gimel brises was alle nemnu these 13 brises, which were all said. The one standing, the Negeya, the bris Porotikinal, as it refers to this individual bris, like we said before. So therefore, it's the same 13, the Rambam and the Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi just brings down an introduction. And the Rambam, that introduction doesn't fit in the Rambam's second halacha test because over here he's talking about the mitzvah of this individual, so we're not going to bring the other pasuk, as opposed to the Rambam. The Yerushalmi is talking about generally about the greatness of circumcision, which is the chlal, because it has the 13 covenant, which shows that the whole idea of bris is an important part in the connection, and therefore it is proper to bring the pasuk by Yemahu Koros Avram with Avram. This is Sichos Shabbos Parshas Nosei, the Yem Beis the Chagas Shavuos and Tovshin Daled Men.